Vienna, 1938. Nazi flags everywhere. Every street corner, every building, every window displays that twisted symbol of hatred and oppression. Large red circle. A formal dinner party at a commander's mansion is about to begin. The guests? High-ranking German officers with medals pinned to their chests and arrogance dripping from their polished boots. They are here to celebrate. To network. To remind everyone in the room exactly who controls Austria now. The dining hall is immaculate. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across perfectly arranged silverware. Servants moving silently between guests, pouring wine that costs more than most Austrians earn in a month. Then something happens that nobody expects. Large red circle. The children stand up to perform. 7 of them, ranging from tiny to teenage, all dressed in matching outfits that their new governess helped them prepare. Cute. Innocent. Well-rehearsed. The officers smile. Children singing at dinner parties was a common entertainment in those days. A pleasant distraction. A reminder of the pure Aryan future they believed they were building. But here's where things get interesting. Large red circle. The songs these children sing aren't random nursery rhymes or German national anthems praising the fatherland. They are Austrian folk songs. Songs praising Austrian freedom. Songs mocking German authority. Songs celebrating everything the Nazis wanted to destroy. And the officers applaud. They clap their hands together with genuine appreciation, nodding at the commander, complimenting him on his well-trained children. They have absolutely no idea what just happened. Large red circle. They just got played by a nanny and 7 kids under the age of 14. This isn't fiction. This isn't some feel-good movie embellishment. This actually happened. And the real story? It's wilder than anything Hollywood ever showed you. Let's break it down. To understand how a young woman with no political training, no military background, and no apparent agenda managed to pull off one of the most brilliant acts of cultural resistance in Nazi-occupied territory, we need to go back. Way back, before the swastikas. Before the annexation. Before everything changed. Large blue circle. Austria in the early 1900s was a peculiar place. It was the remnant of an empire that once stretched across half of Europe. The Habsburg dynasty had ruled for centuries, creating a cultural identity so distinct, so uniquely Austrian, that it couldn't be confused with anything German. Yes, Austrians spoke German. Yes, there were cultural similarities. But ask any Austrian from that era if they were the same as their German neighbors, and they'd look at you like you'd just insulted their. The music was different. The food was different. The attitude was definitely different. Austrians had developed this particular brand of refined casualness that drove Germans crazy. Where Germans valued efficiency and rigid structure, Austrians preferred charm and improvisation. Where Germans marched in straight lines, Austrians waltzed in circles. This wasn't just a stereotype. It was a fundamental cultural divide that would become incredibly important later. Now, sitting right in the heart of this cultural landscape was a city called Salzburg. Large blue circle. Salzburg was Mozart's birthplace, and the locals never let anyone forget it. 85,393. The city dripped with musical heritage. Churches with organs that had been played for centuries. Street musicians performing on corners. Families gather to sing folk songs that have been passed down through generations. Music wasn't just entertainment in Salzburg. It was identity. And in one particular villa on the outskirts of this city lived a man whose story would eventually capture the imagination of millions. We're not there yet. Before we meet the commander, we need to understand what Austria was facing. Because without that context, nothing that happens next makes any sense. See, after World War I, the Austrian Empire collapsed. What was left was a small, landlocked country that didn't quite know what to do with itself. Economically devastated. Politically fractured, culturally confused. Large blue circle. Germany, meanwhile, was building something terrifying under the surface. Adolf Hitler, himself an Austrian by birth, had risen to power with dreams of uniting all German-speaking peoples under one Reich. And Austria was first on his list. Throughout the 1930s, pressure mounted. Nazi sympathizers within Austria grew bolder. The Austrian government tried to maintain independence, but it was like watching a mouse negotiate with a cat. Everyone knew what was coming. Large red circle on March 12, 1938. German troops crossed the border. There was no battle. No resistance. Austrian soldiers stood aside as Wehrmacht units rolled through the streets of Vienna like they owned the place. Because now, they did. This was the Anschluss. The annexation. The moment Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation and became just another province of the Third Reich. For some Austrians, this was a celebration. They lined the streets waving Nazi flags, cheering for Hitler's motorcade, genuinely believing that union with Germany would solve all their problems. For others, it was the end of everything. Their country. Their culture. Their way of life, gone overnight. And caught right in the middle of this historical earthquake was a family that would have to make an impossible choice. But first, let me tell you about the man at the center of it all. Large blue circle. George Ludwig von Trapp was not your typical Austrian aristocrat. Born in 1880 in Zeta, which was then part of the Austrian Empire, George came from a family with serious military credentials. His father was a naval officer. His grandfather was a naval officer. Going back generations, the von Trapps had served the Habsburg monarchy on the seas. George followed tradition. He joined the Austro-Hungarian Navy as a young man and quickly proved himself to be exceptionally talented at one very specific thing: large red circle submarine warfare. Now, you might be thinking, wait, Austria had submarines? Austria is landlocked. Fair point. But remember, the Austrian Empire at that time controlled a significant Mediterranean coastline. They had a proper navy. And George von Trapp became one of its deadliest submarine commanders. During World War I, he commanded multiple submarines and sank enemy vessels with a precision that earned him the nickname, the last Corsair of the Mediterranean. Large blue circle. He received the highest military honors Austria could give, including the Maria Theresa Cross, an award so prestigious that it automatically elevated the recipient to nobility. That's how George became Baron von Trapp. Not through inherited wealth or family connections, but through being genuinely, terrifyingly good at naval combat. The irony here is almost too perfect. The man who would later become famous for running away from conflict, for choosing family over fighting, was one of the most decorated warriors of his generation. He wasn't a pacifist by nature. He was a pacifist by choice. And that's a completely different thing. After the war ended and the empire collapsed, George found himself in an awkward position. Austria no longer had a navy. His skills were obsolete. His rank was meaningless. Large blue circle. He married a woman named Agathe Whitehead, granddaughter of Robert Whitehead, the inventor of the modern torpedo. Yes, you read that correctly. The submarine commander married the torpedo heiress. Sometimes history writes itself. Together, they had 7 children. 7. That's not a family, that's a baseball team with substitutes. But their happiness didn't last. In 1922, Agathe contracted scarlet fever and died, leaving George alone with 7 children ranging from a toddler to a young teenager. This man, this decorated war hero who had faced death countless times underwater, now faced something far more terrifying. Single parenthood. And he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. Now here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because if you're picturing George von Trapp as some kind of gentle, singing, kite-flying father figure, you need to recalibrate immediately. Large red circle. The real George von Trapp was terrifying. Not cruel, exactly. But strict in a way that would make modern parenting experts faint. He ran his household exactly like he ran his submarines. Schedules were followed to the minute. Children were summoned using a bosun's whistle. Each child had their own signal. When they heard their pattern, they were expected to appear immediately and stand at attention. No delays. No childhood nonsense. The children were forbidden from speaking at mealtimes unless spoken to. They addressed their father as Captain or Sir. Physical affection was considered undisciplined. Emotional expression was weak. This wasn't because George didn't love his children. He did, desperately. But he had no model for fatherhood beyond military command. His own father had been strict. His training had been stricter. The only language he knew for expressing care was discipline. Large blue circle. The children's names, in order, were Rupert, Agathe, Maria, Werner, Hedwig, Johanna, and Martina. Each had their own personality, their own struggles with their father's rigid expectations. Rupert, the eldest, tried to live up to his father's military standards. Werner, the only other boy, felt crushed under the weight of expectation. The girls found their own ways to cope with a household that felt more like a barracks than a home. And they all missed their mother desperately. The villa had become a quiet place after Agathe died. Not peaceful and quiet. Oppressive quiet, the kind of quiet where laughter feels like a violation. George retreated into his grief, becoming even more distant, even more formal with his children. The servants managed the day-to-day operations. Governesses came and went, unable to handle either the strict household requirements or the 7 heartbroken children who didn't know how to ask for what they needed. Large blue circle. By 1926, George had gone through multiple governesses. One lasted a few months before finding some excuse to leave. The children were too wild. Too sad. Too complicated. The father was too demanding. Too cold. Too impossible to please. It seemed like no one could fix what was broken in that villa. Then came Maria. But not the Maria you're expecting. Large blue circle. Maria Augusta Kuchera was born in 1905 in Vienna. Her childhood was, to put it mildly, a disaster. Her mother died when Maria was still a toddler. Her father, unable to cope with single parenthood, gave her to a relative who raised her in an environment so emotionally barren that Maria later described it as growing up without ever experiencing love. She was told, repeatedly, that she was unwanted. That she was a burden, that she should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention she received. By her teenage years, Maria had developed a fiercely independent personality as a defense mechanism. She was loud where she was supposed to be quiet. Opinionated when she was supposed to be agreeable, athletic and outdoorsy in an era when young women were expected to be delicate and homebound. Large blue circle. She attended university to study education, which was unusual for women at the time. She discovered she loved nature, hiking, and especially music. But something was missing. Despite her external rebellion, Maria was searching for meaning, for belonging, for something that would make her feel like she mattered. Large red circle. At 19. She entered the Nonnberg Abbey in Salzburg to become a nun. This seems like a contradiction, right? A rebellious, loud, outdoorsy young woman deciding to join a convent known for its strict rules and silent contemplation. But it makes sense when you understand what Maria was really looking for. Not religion, exactly, structure. Meaning. A family that couldn't abandon her. The abbey offered all of that. The Benedictine nuns at Nonnberg lived by routines that dated back centuries. Every hour had its purpose. Every day had its rhythm. Every sister had her place in the community. For someone who had grown up in chaos, this was intoxicating. Maria threw herself into convent life with characteristic intensity. Large blue circle. But there was a problem. Several problems, actually. Large red circle. Maria was terrible at being a nun. Not at the spiritual parts. She prayed with genuine devotion. She believed with her whole heart. But the practical requirements of convent life? Those were her downfall. She couldn't stay still. She couldn't stay quiet. She couldn't resist climbing trees in her habit, or whistling in the corridors, or saying exactly what she thought when silence was expected. The other sisters didn't know what to do with her. She was too alive for a place built on stillness. Too loud for a community that communicated through glances, too colorful for a world of black and white habits. The mother abbess watched Maria with a mixture of affection and concern. This girl clearly had gifts. Energy, passion, and an obvious love for God and for life. But were those gifts meant for the convent? Or for somewhere else entirely? The answer came in 1926, when Captain George von Trapp sent a request to the abbey. He needed a tutor for one of his daughters, who was too ill to attend school. Just temporary. Just one child. Just until she recovered. The mother abbess looked at Maria and saw an opportunity. Maybe some time in the outside world would help Maria understand where she truly belonged. Maybe it would calm her down. Maybe it would help her realize that the convent was her calling after all. Or maybe, just maybe, the mother abbess knew exactly what she was doing. Large red circle. Maria was sent to the Von Trapp villa as a temporary governess. She was supposed to stay for 10 months. She was supposed to return to the convent after that. She was supposed to take her final vows and become a real nun. None of that happened. Large blue circle. Maria arrived at the Von Trapp villa in the autumn of 1926 with a guitar, a small suitcase, and absolutely no idea what she was walking into. Large red circle. Her first impression of the household was horror. The children were lined up in the main hall, wearing sailor suits that matched, standing at attention like little soldiers. The captain stood at the front, whistle in hand, calling each child forward with their designated signal. They didn't speak unless spoken to. They didn't smile. They moved like automatons. Maria looked at these 7 children and saw herself. Not the wealthy surroundings. Not the servants. Not the social status. She saw desperately lonely children. Children who had been taught that love came with conditions. Children who had forgotten how to be children. And something inside her broke open. Large blue circle. But Maria was clever. She didn't immediately challenge Captain Von Trapp's authority. She didn't march in demanding changes. She didn't lecture him about proper parenting. She understood that confrontation would get her sent back to the convent immediately. So she worked from within. She started with the one child she was hired to teach. Maria Von Trapp, the captain's 3rd daughter, was recovering from scarlet fever and needed to continue her education at home. The governess and the child shared a name, which became a source of amusement. Little Maria and Big Maria would joke about their shared identity. Large red circle. Within weeks, little Maria was transformed. Not just academically. Emotionally. The child who had been quiet and withdrawn started laughing again. Started asking questions, started singing along when the governess pulled out her guitar and played folk songs during study breaks. The other children noticed. One by one, they started finding excuses to be near Maria's lessons. Werner would have homework questions that somehow required an hour of conversation. Hedwig would, accidentally, wander past just as a song was starting. Even Rupert, the eldest, who tried to maintain his father's strict demeanor, couldn't resist the pull. Large red circle. Maria was reintroducing these children to joy. And she was using music to do it. Now, here's something most people don't understand about music in that era. Music wasn't just entertainment. Music was political. Large blue circle. In the years leading up to the Nazi takeover, Austria was engaged in a cultural battle for its identity. German nationalists pushed for Austrians to embrace Germanic culture, Germanic music, and Germanic traditions. Austrian patriots responded by celebrating everything distinctly Austrian. The folk songs, the yodeling, the regional dialects, the traditional dances. Every time an Austrian family gathered to sing traditional songs, they were making a statement. We are not German. We are Austrian. We will not be erased. Maria, raised in Vienna during this cultural conflict, understood this instinctively. The songs she taught the children weren't randomly chosen. Large red circle. They were specifically, deliberately, almost subversively Austrian, songs about the mountains of Salzburg, songs about Austrian history and Austrian heroes. Songs that predated German unification and reminded listeners that Austria had its own identity. Thank you very much. At first, this was innocent. Maria wasn't thinking about politics. She was thinking about giving these children something beautiful. But as the political situation darkened, those same songs would take on entirely new meanings. Large blue circle. Captain Von Trapp noticed changes in his household. At first, he was suspicious. The children were laughing more, talking more, gathering together in ways they hadn't since their mother died. He heard music coming from the nursery at strange hours. He saw his children looking at their governess with something uncomfortably close to adoration. Large red circle. This bothered him. Not because he didn't want his children to be happy, but because happiness felt like a betrayal of his wife's memory, because discipline had been his only way of coping, because this strange young woman was disrupting everything he had carefully constructed to survive his grief. He tried to reassert control. He issued orders about noise levels. He questioned Maria's teaching methods. He reminded everyone that she was temporary, just here for a few months, and they shouldn't get too attached. Large red circle. Maria ignored him. Not openly. Not disrespectfully. She simply continued doing exactly what she had been doing, with a politeness so impenetrable that the captain couldn't find a proper reason to dismiss her. She followed his rules to the letter while somehow violating their spirit entirely. The children were learning discipline and joy. They were maintaining their schedules and singing in between. They were standing at attention when the whistle blew, and laughing the moment he turned his back. It was maddening. It was exactly what those children needed. And slowly, despite every effort to resist, Captain George von Trapp found himself changing too. Large blue circle. The turning point came on a summer evening in 1927. The captain had returned from a trip to Vienna. Tired and irritable, expecting to find his household in its usual orderly state. Instead, he walked into chaos. Large red circle. His children were performing a puppet show they had made themselves. The puppets were crude, made from old socks and scraps of fabric. The story they were telling didn't make much sense. And they were all singing, loudly and slightly off-key, a folk song that the captain hadn't heard since his own childhood. He stood in the doorway, ready to bellow for order. Ready to demand explanations, ready to find the governess and explain exactly how he expected his children to behave in his absence. But the words wouldn't come. Because his youngest daughter, Martina, had spotted him. And instead of snapping to attention like she was supposed to, she ran across the room and threw her arms around his legs. Papa. Papa, watch. Maria taught us a song about a mountain goat, and it's so funny. George von Trapp looked down at his daughter. Her face was lit up with a joy he hadn't seen since her mother was alive. Her eyes were begging him to stay, to watch, to be part of something. And for the first time in years, the captain didn't know what to do. Large red circle. So he stayed. He sat down in a chair, still wearing his traveling coat, and watched his children perform their ridiculous puppet show. He listened to them sing songs he had forgotten. And somewhere in that evening, something cracked inside his carefully constructed walls. After the children went to bed, he found Maria in the library. He didn't yell at her. He didn't thank her either. He just said, very quietly, "My children are happy." Maria nodded. "They are wonderful children, Captain." I had forgotten what that looked like. There was a long silence. Large red circle. Then George von Trapp did something he hadn't done since his wife died. He picked up his old guitar from the corner of the room. He hadn't touched it in years. His fingers found the chords almost by memory. And he sang. Maria watched the man she had thought of as cold and unreachable pour his heart out through an old Austrian folk song. His voice was rough, out of practice. But the emotion was unmistakable. This was a man who had been drowning in grief and discipline and duty. And music was pulling him back to the surface. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is sweet, but where's the anti-Nazi resistance? Hold on. We're getting there. Because what happened next changed everything. Large blue circle. Maria's 10 months at the villa were supposed to end in summer 1927. She was supposed to return to the convent. She was supposed to take her vows. The mother abbess had already begun preparing for her return. But Maria didn't want to leave. Large red circle. And it wasn't just because of the children. Something had shifted in her relationship with the captain. Something that confused her, frightened her, and filled her with a longing she had never experienced before. She had feelings for him. Real feelings, the kind that a woman about to become a nun definitely should not have. Large blue circle. Maria did what anyone with her background would do. She ran. Without telling anyone, she packed her small bag and returned to the convent, convinced that distance would solve everything. She would pray. She would meditate. She would find her calling again. Large red circle. But the mother abbess saw through her immediately. "You love him," the old woman said. It wasn't a question. Maria couldn't deny it. And here's where the mother abbess proved to be one of the wisest characters in this entire story. She didn't tell Maria that loving a man was wrong. She didn't lecture her about vows or duty. She simply said, "You have to go back. You have to face this. God doesn't call us to run away from love. He calls us to understand it." Large red circle. Maria returned to the villa. And within months, George von Trapp asked her to marry him. Not with flowers and romantic declarations. He asked her in the most George von Trapp way possible, practically. "The children need a mother," he said. "And I need a wife. Would you consider staying?" It wasn't poetry. But Maria understood what he was really saying. "I love you. I don't know how to say it. But I do." Large red circle. They were married on November 26, 1927. Maria was 22 years old. George was 47. She went from almost none to mother of 7 overnight. The marriage changed the dynamics of the household completely. But here's something fascinating that most people don't realize. Large blue circle. Maria didn't immediately take over as the family's musical director. In fact, the family's musical traditions had existed before her. The children's birth mother, Agathe, had been musical. George himself was a trained musician. What Maria did was revive something that had been dormant. Large red circle. She didn't create the family's music. She resurrected it. And in doing so, she permitted George to be someone he had forgotten he could be. The household transformed. Those sailor suits started appearing less frequently. The whistle was used less often. Laughter echoed through halls that had been silent for years. Large blue circle. Maria had 3 more children with George, bringing the total to 10. Rosemary, Eleanor, and Johannes joined the family. The villa became crowded, chaotic, and full of music. But this wasn't just a feel-good family story. Because outside those walls, the world was changing dangerously, and the Von Trapp family was about to be tested in ways they never imagined. Large blue circle. Throughout the early 1930s, Austria struggled to maintain its independence. The global Great Depression had devastated the economy. Political extremism was rising on all sides. And Germany, under Nazi control since 1933, was making increasingly aggressive moves toward unification. Large red circle. The Von Trapp family felt these pressures acutely. George was known as a war hero, a decorated commander, a symbol of Austrian military tradition. The Nazis wanted him. They approached him multiple times, suggesting that a man of his stature would be welcomed in the new German Navy. Each time, he refused. George von Trapp was many things, but he was not a fool. He saw what the Nazis truly represented. The hatred, the aggression, the complete abandonment of every value he had served. He wanted nothing to do with them. Large blue circle. But refusing the Nazis was becoming increasingly dangerous. Especially after March 1938. When Germany annexed Austria, everything changed. Large red circle. The morning after the Anschluss, Nazi flags appeared everywhere. Salzburg, once a city of Mozart and churches and folk music, was suddenly a city of swastikas. George walked through his beloved city and didn't recognize it. His friends were being arrested. His neighbors were informed against him. The Austria he had served, the Austria he had nearly died for, was disappearing before his eyes. Large red circle. And then came the pressure. The new regime didn't make requests. They made demands. They wanted George to accept a commission in the German Navy. They wanted him to fly the Nazi flag from his villa. They wanted him to prove his loyalty to the new order. George refused everything. Every demand. Every request. Every veiled threat. But he knew this couldn't last. The Nazis didn't forget. They didn't forgive. Sooner or later, refusing them would have consequences. Now we arrive at the moment you've been waiting for. The dinner party, the performance, the brilliant, dangerous act of resistance that the Nazi officers never even noticed. Large blue circle. It happened in the summer of 1938, just months after the annexation. By this point, the Von Trapp family was famous throughout Salzburg for their music. They had performed at local events, church functions, and private gatherings. Their harmony was remarkable. Their repertoire was distinctly Austrian. Large red circle. A high-ranking Nazi official, visiting Salzburg, heard about this musical family. He requested a private performance. Not asked. Requested. In Nazi Austria, those were the same thing. Large blue circle. George was trapped. Refusing outright would mark him as an enemy of the regime. But agreeing felt like collaboration. He and Maria discussed it late into the night. Finally, they made a decision. The family would perform. But they would perform on their own terms. Large red circle. Maria had been preparing for something like this for months. Ever since the annexation, she had been selecting songs with special care. Traditional Austrian folk songs that celebrated everything the Nazis wanted to erase, songs about the Austrian Alps, not the German ones. Songs about Habsburg heroes, not Nazi ones, songs with lyrics that, if you knew where to look, contained subtle mockery of German pretensions. Large blue circle the children had been rehearsing without fully understanding the implications. To them, these were just the songs Maria had always taught them. But Maria knew exactly what she was doing. Large red circle, she was building a repertoire of musical resistance. And the dinner party was her moment to deploy it. Large blue circle, the night of the performance arrived. The Von Trapp villa was filled with Nazi officers, local officials who had eagerly embraced the new regime, and a few of George's old friends who had chosen collaboration over resistance. George greeted his guests with perfect formal courtesy. His face revealed nothing. His heart burned with contempt. Large blue circle, the dinner proceeded normally. Food was served. Wine was poured. The officers discussed their plans for Austria's integration into the Reich. George listened and said as little as possible. Then came the time for the entertainment. Large red circle, the children assembled in the grand hall. 7 voices, trained to perfect harmony, led by their stepmother, who stood slightly to the side, her face calm and pleasant. Large blue circle, the first song began. An innocent Austrian folk tune about mountain flowers. The officers smiled politely. Charming children. Beautiful harmonies. But here's what they didn't understand. The song was old. Very old. Predating German unification by centuries. Its lyrics referenced an Austria that existed before Germany was even a concept. Large red circle, it was a subtle declaration of independence, disguised as a pretty folk song. The officers didn't catch it. How could they? They didn't know Austrian cultural history well enough to recognize what they were hearing. Large blue circle, the second song was bolder. A tune about Austrian freedom, Austrian mountains, Austrian identity. Large red circle, the lyrics included phrases about standing against the foreign wind and keeping the homeland pure. In context, these were clearly about resistance to outside influence. But the officers heard what they wanted to hear. They assumed that foreign wind referred to whatever enemies they imagined. They assumed that pure homeland meant Aryan ideology. They applauded their own mockery without realizing it. Maria watched their faces as they clapped. These men had destroyed everything she loved about Austria. Who had turned neighbors into informants. Who had made fear the primary language of daily life. They were applauding while she mocked them to their faces. Large red circle, the third song was the most dangerous. An old resistance song from the Tyrolean uprisings against Napoleon. On the surface, it celebrated the Austrian victory over the French invaders. But the parallels were unmistakable. A foreign power is invading Austria. Brave Austrians resisting oppression. Ultimate triumph of the Austrian spirit over military might. Large blue circle, every Austrian in the room understood immediately what Maria was doing. The old friends who had chosen collaboration shifted uncomfortably. George's face remained carefully neutral, but his eyes shone with something like pride. Large red circle, the Nazi officers noticed nothing. To them, it was just another pretty folk song performed by adorable children. They clapped enthusiastically. One officer even commented on how wonderful it was to see Austrian culture being preserved. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Large blue circle, but Maria wasn't done yet. The final song of the evening was her masterpiece. Large red circle, she had taught the children a song called Edelweiss. Not the version from the musical, which was actually written for the movie, but a traditional Austrian song with similar themes. A song about a small white flower that only grows in the highest Austrian mountains. A flower that represents everything Austrian, resilient, pure, impossible to transplant to foreign soil. As her children's voices rose in perfect harmony, singing about this flower that refused to grow anywhere but Austria, Maria felt tears threatening to spill. Not from sadness, from a fierce, burning pride. Large red circle, they couldn't take Austria's music, they couldn't take Austria's soul. And as long as families like hers kept singing these songs, Austria would never truly be defeated. Even when it means losing everything. So what happened to everyone? Large blue circle, Maria von Trapp lived until 1987, dying at age 82 in Vermont. She spent her later years writing, speaking, and running the Trapp Family Lodge, a hotel that still exists today. The children scattered across the world, but many stayed connected to music. Several became accomplished musicians in their own right. The trap name continued to carry weight in classical and folk music circles. Large red circle. The villa in Salzburg still stands. It's now a hotel called Villa Trap. Tourists can visit the rooms where the family lived, where Maria taught those subversive songs, where George rediscovered his ability to feel. Large blue circle. Austria itself eventually recovered. After World War II, it regained independence and rebuilt its cultural identity. Those folk songs that the Von Trapps preserved are still sung today. And here's the beautiful irony: the Nazis wanted to erase Austrian culture. They wanted to absorb Austria into Germany so completely that within a generation, no one would remember the difference. Large red circle. They failed. Partly because of families like the Von Trapps, partly because culture is harder to kill than conquerors ever realized, partly because songs, once learned, live in memory even when everything else is taken away. Those children who sang at the dinner party grew up to have children of their own. And they taught those children the same songs. And those children taught their children. The musical resistance continues across generations. But let's zoom out even further. Because this story isn't really about one family. It is about something much bigger. Large blue circle. Throughout history, oppressed people have used culture as resistance. Slaves in America sang spirituals coded with escape routes. Jews in the Holocaust kept songs alive in concentration camps. Soviet dissidents passed banned poetry through underground networks. Large red circle. The weapon is always the same. Beauty that the oppressor doesn't understand, meaning that passes right over the tyrant's head, messages hidden in plain sight. The Von Trapps weren't unique in using this weapon. They were part of a tradition that stretches back through human history. And that tradition continues today. Large blue circle. Every time someone creates art that challenges power, they are walking in the same path. Every protest song, every subversive poem, every coded message in a piece of entertainment carries that same spirit. Large red circle. The dinner party performance wasn't a singular moment. It was one note in a symphony of resistance that has been playing for thousands of years and will continue long after we're all gone. And here's what makes Maria's story specifically powerful. She wasn't a trained revolutionary. She wasn't a political strategist. She was a young woman who barely survived a loveless childhood, who almost became a nun, who stumbled into a broken family and started teaching children to sing. Large red circle. The resistance didn't require special skills. It required choosing, every single day, to create beauty instead of surrendering to ugliness. To sing Austrian songs in a world trying to make Austria disappear. To raise children who knew who they were, even when the world tried to tell them otherwise. That's a choice anyone can make. Large blue circle. Now, I've told you a lot of facts and stories. But let me leave you with something to think about. What are the songs that define who you are? Not just your national anthem. Not just what's on the radio. The deeper songs. The ones that connect you to your family, your community, your history. Large blue circle. Do you know them? Could you sing them? Could you teach them children? Large red circle. Because culture is fragile. It survives only if people actively choose to preserve it. Every tradition that dies was once someone's living memory. Every song that's forgotten was once sung with passion. Maria understood this instinctively. That's why she taught those children to sing. Not just for entertainment, not just for discipline, but because she knew that if you lose your songs, you lose your soul. Large blue circle. The Nazis could take Austria's government. They could take its borders. They could take its army and its institutions and its official identity. Large red circle. But they couldn't take what lived in the hearts and voices of its people. As long as one Austrian sang one Austrian song, Austria survived. That's the real lesson of Maria's story. That's why a nanny teaching children to sing matters more than most things history remembers. That's why 7 kids performing for Nazi officers is one of the most powerful acts of resistance you've never properly heard about. The dinner party ended around midnight. The officers left, satisfied with their evening of culture. The children went to bed, exhausted from performing. George and Maria stood together in the empty hall. He looked at her with something unreadable in his eyes. Do you think they understood? Maria shook her head. Not a word. We can't keep doing this forever. I know. Large red circle. They stood in silence for a moment, two people who had found each other against all odds, facing a future that seemed impossible. Then George smiled. That rare smile that Maria had spent years drawing out of him. But tonight was ours, Maria leaned against him. Yes. Tonight was ours, large blue circle, and somewhere in the mountains beyond their window, an edelweiss bloomed white against the dark rocks, small, resilient, impossible to uproot, just like the spirit of the family inside, just like the songs they would carry across oceans, just like the legacy they would leave behind. So yeah. Now you know the real story. A young woman who couldn't quite manage to be a nun. A widowed commander who had forgotten how to feel. 7 children who needed to learn how to be children again, and a dinner party where Nazi officers applauded their own mockery without ever catching on. That's not a fairy tale. That's history. And it's wilder than any musical ever captured. If this story made you think about the power of culture, about small acts of resistance, about how ordinary people can stand against extraordinary evil, then good. That means Maria's mission succeeded. Because the real message was never just about one family. It was about all of us. About what we choose to preserve, about what we choose to sing, about whether we pass our songs to the next generation or let them disappear. Now that you know how cultural resistance actually works, you're probably wondering about other stories of people who used art against oppression. There's a whole video right here about artists who defied dictators with their creativity. Click it. Your curiosity will thank you.